Terry Delano, the president of the Delano Kindred, and I am delighted that you guys are all here. Hopefully there'll be a lot more that show up shortly.
I'm going to put it on.
It's
The
on.
mic.
It's on.
This one?
Yep, it's
We can't
on.
hear you.
I'll talk louder. Is that better? Or you can turn it up. One or the other.
Turn your hearing aids down.
Yeah, that works for me too. So to get things started off, there are some do's and don'ts here for the Millicent Library, and to introduce us to where the facilities are and exits and all that kind of stuff. I'm introducing Kathy Delano, and by the way, Kathy is the one primarily responsible for making this whole thing happen for us this year. So thank you, Kathy.
What we were going to do for a program, and we had a presentation by our tourism director, Chris Richards, on John Cook, who was the Fairhaven pilgrim. So he settled in this area about the same time as Jonathan Delano. So I had the good fortune of sitting next to Don Plant from the Dartmouth Historical and Art Society, and he told me there was an amazing program happening that Sunday. So I went to it, and I met this panel, and Sally, who was here somewhere, and afterwards I introduced myself and asked Sally if she would speak. And she put me in touch with Richard Gifford and with Bob Harding, who's the president, and I was just so astonished at the research that they've done, at the scholarship. I looked at their website afterwards, and it's amazing. So I recommend it to all of you, and I think what you're going to hear today is going to be very exciting. Richard is going to be talking about some of the old homesteads, including Jabez, and we're expecting one of his direct descendants to be here, Ellen Mora, and trying to pinpoint where Jonathan Delano's homestead was. And then Bob is going to be talking about some of the old records and surprises that he's found in the records. And Sally is going to give us an amazing history of how this all started. So I'm going to turn it back to Terry, who's going to introduce Muriel, who is our genealogist, and also the Mayflower historian of Florida. Right?
Right.
I think that's everything. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kathy.
Okay.
What? You want me to use the mic? No, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do this. This mic doesn't go very far, so I'll just sit down here. Couple of things. There is a table to the right, your left, as you're sitting there, that's got some snacks and good stuff on it. And in the cooler, just to the left of the table, are small bottles of water. Help yourself, and you feel free to get up anytime you need, move around or whatever. As Kathy said, it's going to be a long afternoon, but we'll take breaks in between the speakers. And if you have questions, the speakers have said they would be happy to answer questions after their presentation. And I would like to take a minute to introduce Muriel Cushing, who is on the first, and I've asked her to go over some publications that she has researched and produced and let you know about that. But a little bit about Muriel Cushing. She's one of the founding members of the Delano Kindred and happens to be the genealogist, the state historian, I should say, for the Mayflower Society for the state of Florida, as well as the Delano Kindred genealogist. So all of the research that she's going to tell you about in her books, she did it. So she's done an awful lot of work for us. She is also a past president of the Delano Kindred. The other Delano Kindred speaker, I put him on last, so he stands between you and going to supper. And that's George Delano. And I can't help it if you can't pronounce his name right. But George is the first president of the Delano Kindred Society and was the president for an awful long time until he conned somebody else into letting him go. But he's also our newsletter editor. So for those of you who have stumbled across our newsletter, the Bon Nouvelle, George is the one responsible for putting all of that together and an awful lot of the articles therein. So without any further delay, let me introduce Muriel. You can talk, if you would, about the PFIPs that you've been working on.
Okay, do you want me to use the microphone?
Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Yeah. Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. So good to see so many friends here. I've missed you all. We didn't miss you last year. We did. Anyway, I'm just going to say a few words about what I've been doing, and I have finished all of the first 7 generations for the Delano Kindred. The 6th book, I think it's the 6th or 7th, is going to the publishers soon. And now they want me to do a hardcover book. I wanted a silver book, and they're not going to do that, I don't think, but we can choose a different color, and we can bring that up for discussion. I was thinking maybe a silvery green, which green is the Delano Country color. I'm also working on the silver book for Rebecca Alden, which is Thomas Delano's wife. So this will be all of Thomas Delano line, and that will be a silver book. The other one will not be, but it will be hardcover, and it will take all the information that I have. Do you want me to say anything else?
You wanted to talk maybe about your Women in Mayflower project?
The Women of the Mayflower Project, I was the chair for the Women of the Mayflower, and I gave that up because I couldn't handle all the work that I've been doing. I'm still on the committee, and I am in the process of writing an article about Joseph Clement Delano, whose wife went to sea with him, and it's about the hens frigates, they called it, the women that went to sea, and the problems that they had at sea with disease and pirates and all their problems at sea. But anyway, that's still in progress, and I had hoped to give a little demonstration of it today, which I didn't have time to finish. Women of the Mayflower is to promote the women that were on the Mayflower. You hear so much about the men, but you don't hear anything about the women, and that's what we're trying to promote. And Joseph Delano's wife was a member of the Mayflower, and also Joseph was. Okay?
All right, thank you.
Make it quick. We're done.
Sally, I am Sally Aldrich, and in 1987 I received a BA in history from University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, formerly Southeastern Massachusetts University. Participating in its history honors program, I did a thesis on early land ownership in Dartmouth before 1800, which is the basis of this talk. Next. When I say Dartmouth, I mean the lands of Westport, Dartmouth, New Bedford, Acushnet, and Fairhaven, which constituted Old Dartmouth until 1787, when the towns first split apart. And in the case of Westport, it included some of Tiverton and Little Compton. I have provided a handout giving a chronology of important events between 1600 and 1800, which affected this region of New England as they relate to my talk. My discussion today is about English settlers in the region, ignoring Native Americans, their legitimate land claims, and mentioning only briefly the 1652 Indian deed to William Bradford. This particular deed, recorded in 1654 in Plymouth, purportedly gave sole ownership to the English colonists at Plymouth of a tract of land stretching from 2 miles west of the west branch of the Westport River to 3 miles east of the Acushnet River and about 8 miles inland. I firmly believe the Native Americans had no concept of private land ownership, and that the deed was considered by the deed was considered by the Native Americans to be a treaty for the temporary use of their land and not a permanent land transfer. Their population had been decimated by European diseases to which they had no immunity, so they were willing to loan it. The goods given by the English were gifts of cloth, metal tools, and hospitality items not easily obtainable by the native peoples, who agreed to withdraw within 1 year. There was never any doubt that the white men would take possession of the Indian lands. It was only a matter of which of them would do it. The real reason the English obtained such Indian deeds was to thwart the claims of other European settler groups pushing into New England, such as the Dutch in New York. How it began for Dartmouth. The history of Old Dartmouth begins in Plymouth. We all know about the Mayflower Pilgrims coming to Plymouth in 1620, followed by other ships soon after. They struggled to survive and had financed the settlement with loans from English merchants. These loans had to be paid back. In 1627, a group of Plymouth settlers assumed the debt and were often referred to as purchasers. The Warwick Patent. The Plymouth settlers had obtained a series of charters from the English monarchy to legalize their existence as an English colony. But the most important one was the Charter of 1629, called the Warwick Patent, signed by the Earl of Warwick on behalf of the king. It covered the territory roughly from the Cohasset River, which is south of Boston, to the Narragansett Bay in the west, and all of what became Plymouth and Bristol counties and the Cape of the Islands. Some call this the Bradford Charter, after Governor William Bradford. Easy land tenure, free and common socage. The land was to be holden of His Majesty of England, his heirs and successors, as of his manor of East Greenwich, in the county of Kent, in free and common socage, and not in capite nor by knight service. You will see this wording in the early deeds. It is also known as easy land tenure. Free and common socage was the most sought after form by English colonists in the New World. It wasn't feudal. It didn't mean the firstborn son got everything. It didn't create a royal province, and it wasn't like what most Englishmen had known at home. What happened next? Plymouth grew crowded. In January 1630, the population was about 300. By 1643, there were approximately 2,000 people, and they all clamored for land. But the land covered by the Warwick Patent was held by the purchasers, the old-comers who had arrived in Plymouth by 1627 because they had paid off the English debt. Land in places like Plymouth, Duxbury, and Marshfield had been given out to families, but much more land remained available, and Governor William Bradford was in charge. A deal was reached. In 1641, it was agreed that the old-comer purchasers could have sole ownership to 3 reserved tracts of land carved out of the Warwick Patent, and the rest of it would be surrendered to the Plymouth court to parcel out to everyone who had come after 1627. Reserved tract number 1 was on the mid-cape about where Yarmouth is today. Reserved tract number 3 was about where Rehoboth is today, east of Providence, Rhode Island. Reserved tract number 2 was Old Dartmouth, which became our 4 towns of Westport, Dartmouth, Cushing, and Fairhaven, and the city of New Bedford. Each old-comer could select in which reserved tract he would participate by taking a share in it. He did not generally participate in more than 1 tract. However, almost 15 years had passed between 1627 and 1641, and another 11 years passed until 1652, when the Dartmouth Propriety was set up to handle Reserve Tract Number 2. In those 26 years, many oldcomers had died and new generations formed. Their families could take their place unless an entire line had died out, as was true for John Craxton. So, if you just want to pause right there, Bob, just in case anyone can't see it. Actually, can you go back one? In case anyone is not too familiar with, okay, Dartmouth is Reserve Tract Number 2. Over here you have Yarmouth. It's not exactly the same as Yarmouth today. It's a little bit of Brewster and Easton, but it's basically in that area. And then over here by Providence is Reserve Tract Number 3, which is near Pawtucket, Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, right on the border there. So those are the 3 tracts. On to the next one. And then this is a blow-up of Reserve Tract Number 2, and you'll notice one thing. Okay. Here is Fairhaven right here. You can see this dotted line that goes up and around here. You notice it goes all the way to Narragansett Bay. Okay, and then there's a little line here which ended up being the division. You can find this in Bradford's book, William Bradford's book. Okay, so here, right in the center of this is what the current town of Dartmouth. You've got Westport on the west, you've got New Bedford, and you've got Fairhaven and Acushnet over here, just in case anyone isn't too familiar with the geography. Now the list of proprietors. These are the oldcomers who chose tract number 2. The list of proprietors of Dartmouth in 1652 appears on the screen. It's also on your handout, on the back of your handout. 34 shares held by 36 people, 3 of them widows. 4 people got only a half share. More confusion arose for Dartmouth because the original list of 1652 was lost. So the proprietors constructed a new list from memory and had the Plymouth General Court record it. Then the original list resurfaced in 1660, and that was also recorded. In the 8 years between 1652 and 1660, further changes were made, and Governor William Bradford died in 1657, which was right in the middle of the period. There are many lists which have been published, and we are actually still researching their accuracy. What you see on the screen and in the handout is my composite, which is certainly open to a challenge. And if you look in the old Plymouth Colony books, and you see, they've got in 1660, they recorded what was the original one, and then it's followed by the one for 1652, which they say should be marked null and void, because the 1652 one was the one made from memory, and the one that's recorded in 1660 was the actual one that was done in 1652. So you can see how it got very complicated, and is still complicated, and we're still working on it. In any event, these were shareholders. That is different from landowners, as I shall soon explain. How is Dartmouth different from other New England towns? There was no governmental land grant to a group of settlers to build a new community with church, village green, houses, and farmland. That type of grant generally would allow a settler to homestead on a piece of land for a stated length of time, farm it, and then own it outright. Those settlers were landowners, not shareholders. Reserve Tract Number 2 was owned by the oldcomers, who had selected it as shareholders in the Dartmouth Propriety formed in 1652. By the time of the earliest homestead settlements in Dartmouth in 1660, 40 years had passed since 1620. The oldcomers were old indeed, and their families had settled comfortably in the Plymouth region. Except for 1 or 2, like John Cook, oldcomers did not move here. although some of their descendants did. For those 36 people holding a total of 34 shares in the propriety, it was like money in the bank. It was simply an asset of value in no fixed location except with reference to the whole tract. A great many of those shares were sold to others who came mostly from the Newport direction and also from Sandwich on the Cape. The buyers were ready to start a new life. How is the Dartmouth propriety different from the town of Dartmouth, chartered in 1664? They were two separate entities. Each kept different records, had different functions, and had different rules. The propriety originally owned all the land. You could be a proprietor and not live in the town, and you didn't have to own land to live in the town. You could be an inhabitant with personal wealth, be a tradesman, or an indentured servant and live in the town. Wives and children were also inhabitants. The town set its own standards for the admittance of its inhabitants, and also decided who was allowed to vote on town matters. The propriety and the town kept totally separate records. Another speaker, Bob Harding, who is running the slideshow for me, will talk more today about how the town functioned and about the lives of the inhabitants. How could an inhabitant get land in the town of Dartmouth? A, you could be an old comer participating in Reserve Tract number 2 and thus own a share in the Dartmouth propriety. If you moved here, you became an inhabitant. John Cook was an old comer who did that with his family, but very few others did. B, you could receive a full share or a fractional share from the old comer in your family by deed or inheritance, then move here. This would apply to the Delanos. You could sell part of the share you got, and if you retained some part of it for yourself, you remained a proprietor. If you sold the whole share, you were no longer a proprietor. And C, you could buy a share or part of one from an original shareholder or from someone who had already done that. This also made you a proprietor. What is the difference between a shareholder and a landholder? A proprietor is a shareholder who owns land in common with others, but is not yet a landowner. Owner of private land set off to him individually. To get from a shareholder to a landowner required a division of land voted by the propriety. What are proprietors' records and what happened to them? The propriety kept its records at the clerk's house. In 1725, Thomas Hathaway held that position. His house burned down, and with it all the records. What we have today is a partial reconstruction of records for the 75 years before the fire, 1660 to 1725, and for the 75 years after the fire, from 1726 to roughly 1800. Starting in 1726, the propriety asked anybody with any records copied out of the original books after the fire to bring those documents in so that they could be copied back into the proprietor's new books. The chronology is off because they were copied whenever they were brought in and not when they were originally issued. What concerned James Cogden in 1867? James Cogden in 1867 was commissioned by the Massachusetts legislature to make sense out of the proprietor's records. There were 5 books in dilapidated condition. One was the Book of Proprietors' Corporate Meetings, which were held to vote the land divisions and to conduct their mundane but important business. Cogden didn't see the need to transcribe that book, but I did. The document I typed is now available on the Dartmouth Historical and Art Society website. Cogden did preserve the other 4 books, and they record the various landowners and shareholders describing their claims, giving land descriptions, acreage, when they got it, from whom they got it, and who the original old comer shareholder was. The records before 1725 are not in chronological order because of the fire, and the necessary reconstruction. Congdon's letter to his bosses explaining what he was doing is also available to read on the Dartmouth HAS website. Apparently, it took him 5 years to transcribe the 1,000 pages in the 4 books on which he worked. He finished in 1872. Dan Socha, who is in our audience here filming today, has worked long and hard on creating an index for use with those digital records on the Dartmouth HAS website. These are called volumes A and B. Finally, how did the propriety work? The Dartmouth propriety was a corporation, a legal entity separate from its shareholders. In 1652, it held title to one big undivided tract of vacant land. Its shareholders had a proportionate share in common with all the other shareholders in this land. The tract got smaller over time as shareholders claimed pieces of it, but even a century later, the propriety still owned a sizable tract of common land. As a corporation, it could sue and be sued, and it was. The land the propriety owned produced no income, and the propriety had no power to tax until 1753. That's a century after it got started. It tried a voluntary tax system in the 1730s, which, being voluntary, failed. After the 1730s, it got into great debt, causing accelerating problems in later years. The propriety held meetings whenever enough shareholders requested them. It was shares, not people, that counted. Generally 5 whole shares, later only 3. Upon such a request, the clerk posted notice of the meeting, called a warrant, at public places such as the mills, warning of the date and time of the meeting. At the meeting, the propriety needed a quorum, not of people, but of shares. Then it had a moderator to conduct the meeting and had a clerk to record the proceedings. It followed an agenda that had appeared in the notice and passed votes by majority by voting them, or it voted them down. It appointed agents to take care of business matters and committees for specific purposes, such as working with the surveyors. The surveyor committees were very important, but most important was the need for a majority vote, the only real requirement to get any business done. What did the propriety vote on? Now, if you could look at your handout, you can see at the bottom. Divisions of land. There were 3 categories: upland, meadow, and cedar swamp. And you can see a summary on the below the chronology on the handout. There were 5 upland divisions. 200 acres by 1660, that was the time of the first settlements, plus 400 in 1682 and 200 in 1694, consolidated in 1710 into what was called the 800-acre division. 400 more were added in 1713 and 300 by 1730. That was the last one. This made a total of 1,500 acres per share. Upland was where you had your homestead farm, your house, your cultivated fields, and your farm buildings. It was where you lived and worked. There was 1 meadow division of 36 acres per share by 1680. Meadow consisted of saltwater and freshwater marshes, wetlands, beaches, mudflats, and small islands. We had plenty of coastline and plenty of wetlands. Meadow grasses grew wild and abundantly and were natural food for cattle. Farmers stored hay for animal bedding and winter feed, used seaweed to fertilize their gardens and their fields, and used hay bales to insulate their houses. There was 1 cedar swamp division of 16 acres per share by 1713. These swamps were generally in the northern part of town and were selected by casting lots. The New Bedford Airport is the Great Cedar Swamp filled in. Cedar Swamp was your woodlot for durable building materials and wood for heating. Atlantic white cedars gave you a cash crop for shingles, roofs, clapboards, fence posts, and railings. White pines made the best ship masts, and pitch and tar were important to the shipbuilding industry. There were also white oaks and red maples in these swamps. What else did the propriety vote on? The appointment of surveyors. The propriety appointed Benjamin Crane, an impartial out-of-towner who toiled as surveyor from 1710 to 1721 with the help of two assistants, Benjamin Hammond and William Manchester. Crane died in 1721, and he was succeeded by Benjamin Hammond from 1723 to 1741. Thankfully, all the field notes were safely in Rochester in 1725 during the fire where the proprietor's clerk's house burned down. Samuel Smith served from 1767 until 1793 when the propriety was winding up. Were there surveyors before Benjamin Crane? Absolutely, but we don't have their names. They were selected in-house and apparently not impartial. That is why the propriety got sued as early as 1684. That is why they brought in Crane. We don't have field notes from any of the early surveyors, but we do have the field notes of Crane and his successors. As mentioned earlier, the propriety voted its own committee members to work with the surveyors to supervise, approve, and record the work being done. What adjustments were made in the land divisions? A, the term qualified by the sample meant that land laid out in each division, except the cedar swamp, was measured against the sample for quality, and the quantity of acreage was adjusted for mean, rocky, boggy land, etc. The sample for the 800-acre consolidated division of upland was Abraham Tucker's homestead. The 400-acre division in 1713 used Philip Tabor's farm, probably now in Adamsville, Rhode Island. And the later 300-acre division used another Philip Tabor farm near the head of Westport. For meadow, it was Samuel Hicks's meadow that lies at the foot of his homestead. At that time, everybody knew where these samples were. And you'll find that in the old deeds, qualified by the sample. B, allowance was made also for current and future roads to be laid out to provide access throughout the town. There was full agreement between the town, which provided highway surveyors, and the propriety on the need for roads. But they had to work out some disagreements about where to put them. And many times you'll see these roads, all the right angles and so on, going around the farms that were already there. In 1722, the propriety surrendered their roads to the town. Also, there were public landings and watering places to be used by everybody for their cattle. C, the mill share. In 1684, John Badcock and Henry Tucker built a mill at Smith Mills in central Dartmouth in exchange for a share of the propriety. All of the proprietors agreed to this except the Soule family, who refused to dilute their share. This 35th share became known as the mill share, and you'll see that also in the old records. How did a shareholder become a landowner? Once the propriety had voted a division in one of the three categories, a shareholder staked a claim on the parcel he wanted by pitching on it. We don't know exactly how that worked, but we surmise he marked the boundaries either physically, for example by slashing trees or making a pile of rocks, or by description. The surveyor came, walked it, measured it with his instruments, and got his work approved by the Propriety Surveyors Committee, and then gave that owner a return of survey, the equivalent of a deed. The owner took the return of survey to the clerk to be entered into the proprietor's book of records. It had the current owner's name, a date, a description of the land, which division was being claimed, and from whose original share the claim derived. The return of survey was kept by the owner, who then owned this land privately and could do with it as he saw fit by deed or inheritance. For this parcel, the shareholder became a landowner. It is important to note that the propriety did not assign you a specific location for your share, or for the acreage you could claim in any division. It was up to you to physically claim the acreage where you wanted it to be. You could take it anywhere in town, and you didn't need to take it all in one place or all at one time. You were still a shareholder in the propriety until all the land had been divided, and that never came to pass. We know that as late as 1800, there were 1, divisions that had not been completed, and 2, land still in common ownership for which the propriety had not voted a division. Were there any restrictions on what a landowner could do with it after taking possession? No. There was no further involvement with the Dartmouth propriety after getting a return of survey for a particular piece of land. Landowners could deed their private land holdings or some portion of it to other people, whether they were already landowners or not, whether they lived in the town or not, whether they were shareholders or not. Deeds between individuals were recorded in the registry of deeds, not with the proprietor's clerk. And inheritance passing as a result of the landowner's death would be handled by the probate court. How big was the Dartmouth proprietary tract? As you can see from the screen, my rough calculation of total land acreage, excluding what is underwater, comes currently in the 4 towns and city that make up Old Dartmouth, comes to 104,000 acres. If the propriety voted only the divisions which I have listed, and we have found no others, each shareholder was entitled to 1,500 shares of upland, acres of upland, 36 of meadow, and 16 of cedar swamp, making a total of 1,552 acres a share. We just have found no other records to add to these divisions. If we agree that the total number of shares in the propriety is 35, we get 54,320 acres total of divided land that can be claimed in an area almost twice the size. Now, this does not take into consideration all of the adjustments for mean, stony, rocky land, etc., or allowance for roads and public places. But still, the divisions voted by the propriety amounted to far less than what was available for distribution, even if you inflate it by, say, 20%. This conclusion is borne out by the many suits brought against the propriety demanding that further divisions be voted. That started as early as 1694. Was the town of Dartmouth ever a proprietor or shareholder? No. The propriety never made the town of Dartmouth a shareholder, even though all the proprietors except one had agreed to create the mill share, which was from 2 private individuals. In the early days, the town had no specific place to conduct municipal affairs. Town meetings were held first at private houses, then at public places like the mills, and only after 1700 in a townhouse. Townhouses were the town's property, but were built on proprietor land, which was not given to the town, even though the propriety also held their meetings there. In 1751, the townhouse had to be moved to a 1/4-acre lot donated by an individual because the propriety was being sued, putting the town-owned building in jeopardy. While the propriety existed, it appears that the town had to buy land like anybody else. In what ways did the propriety work with the town? As mentioned earlier, the 2 entities did cooperate on the laying out of roads, and they also set aside public landings and watering places. In addition, there was the town's responsibility to perambulate the town bounds and settle boundary disputes with its neighbors. The western border was the most controversial. the Dartmouth-Tiverton line was changed innumerable times because it was the focus of a boundary dispute between Massachusetts and Rhode Island. In 1741, the inhabitants of Dartmouth unsuccessfully petitioned Massachusetts to allow them to join Rhode Island. What might the propriety have done differently? If the propriety had gridded out the whole Dartmouth tract, numbered the pieces, and had the shareholders draw lots back in 1660, at the time of the first settlement, its problems would have been solved. It would have gone out of business immediately. This did not happen. What went wrong with the propriety? Everything. Besides the fire, the basic problem was that shareholders did not pitch upon enough parcels to fill up their claims in each division. When the propriety set deadlines, the shareholders ignored them. So the propriety set new deadlines and then did not enforce those. With the passage of time, the propriety lost track of who the shareholders were and therefore didn't know who was eligible to vote. Remember, the propriety could only enact business by majority vote. Time was the enemy. The land division votes went on for 70 years, from 1660 to 1730. Even if every shareholder had taken what was due in each division, the total acreage equaled only about half the acreage of Dartmouth. Most parcels set off were surprisingly small. The proprietors took their parcels, even in the same category, not in one place, but all over town. And we're talking a big acreage because you're talking 4 towns in one city now. The propriety could not adequately reconstruct their records after the fire. The Registry of Deeds serves only for land that has gone into private individual ownership. Those records did exist. It was the returns of survey which the propriety desperately needed to link the set-off parcels to the original shareholders. Moreover, the propriety needed attested copies of the original votes of the various land divisions. What important roles did the Delano men play in the propriety? Jonathan Delano played a critical role. I am not sure whether it was Lieutenant Jonathan, the father, or the son of the same name, as both lived in Dartmouth during the years I mentioned. In any event, Jonathan Delano was the propriety clerk from at least 1709 to 1717, and could have started way earlier. How do I know this if all the records burned up in 1725? You'll see. The years Jonathan served as clerk were the most critical to the propriety. In 1709, 3 men named Allen sued the propriety, saying the layouts in the 800 division were unfair to them, and because of unnamed surveyors, presumably other proprietors, were favoring themselves and their friends. The Allens demanded that His Majesty's justices get somebody else to do the job, and that resulted in the propriety hiring Benjamin Crane, who started in 1710 to redo all the surveying that had been done before and to keep going for another decade. One of the clerk's jobs was to hand out to any proprietor who asked a written copy of the proceedings that the clerk had recorded in the official proprietor's books of records. It's called an attested copy and was of enormous benefit. It created a spare copy that could be brought back in to reconstruct the proprietor's records after the 1725 fire. In 1726, there are entered documents number 4 to number 15, dated from 1709 to 1717, which quote the contents of the document and end, quote, "A true copy taken out of the Dartmouth Purchaser's Book of Records, attest Jonathan Delano, clerk." These are important documents having to do with the various divisions we have just described, and they were contentious enough that someone in those earlier years wanted a copy for themselves. You can explore these documents for yourself on the Dartmouth HAS website. Keep in mind that these records were tattered and torn when transcribed after 250 years and are in some places illegible. In 1717, Thomas Hathaway was clerk. He took over from Jonathan Delano, and he was still in the job when he suffered the misfortune of having his house burned down. Hathaway served until 1730, when Stephen West Jr. took over. In 1723, when Hammond was appointed surveyor as Crane's successor, Nathaniel Delano was one of 4 proprietors on the committee to work with a new surveyor who had been Crane's assistant for many years. In 1726, Jabez Delano was added to the committee. In 1730, both Delanos were working for the propriety. In 1731, with vacant, non-income producing land and mounting debts, the propriety tried a voluntary assessment of £1, 10 shillings per share. The voluntary assessors were Nathaniel Delano, Stephen West Jr., and John Russell. 3 others were appointed to collect the funds. Unfortunately, being voluntary, the whole thing was a failure. Between 1743 and 1753, Nathaniel Delano was actually doing the surveying work for the propriety. Benjamin Hammond had left 2 years earlier, and Samuel Smith did not start work until 1767. In 1753, Bartholomew Tabor took over the surveying part for Nathaniel, but Nathaniel was still on the proprietor's survey committee. That's the committee that approves what the surveyor has done and enters that into the records. In 1753, Massachusetts gave proprieties the power to tax. Dartmouth dragged its feet, but in 1760, Jethro Delano was voted one of the propriety's assessors, with a mandate to raise £115, to which was added in 1762, that was 2 years later, another £45, making a total that they wanted to raise of £160. That sum appears to be the amount he aimed to raise from whichever shareholders he could find. By 1771, debts had climbed to £187, and in the next 20 years, the propriety resorted to selling off about 30 parcels of common land to settle the debts. What were the lawsuits against the propriety about? Lawsuits started as early as 1684, and there were a lot of them. A minority of shareholders fought early on and repeatedly to get full division of all the common lands. They lost, but defending them cost the propriety money it didn't have. Individual proprietors loaned the funds and had to sue themselves to get repayment. Complaints about bias in the distribution of lands were common. There was a lot of contentiousness over the years. Even though the existing records show the propriety made every effort to be fair and equitable to protect the interests of the shareholders who had not yet filled up their claims. Later suits were settled with the propriety reluctantly giving deeds to vacant land. However, for more than a century, the propriety failed to give in to the demands to divide up all the rest of the common land. How did it end? We don't know. The last annual meeting of the propriety was in 1799, with an isolated one in 1821. It had petitioned the court for dissolution in 1771 with no action. The American Revolution may have intervened. The last return of survey was entered in 1835. By the mid-1800s, the courts had ruled that landowners could rely on proprietors' records, returns of survey, and surveyors' field notes for good title to their land, and that applied to Dartmouth. Finally, how did the towns of Westport, Dartmouth, New Bedford, Fairhaven, and Acushnet end up with municipal lands today? My personal theory is that the Massachusetts General Court stepped in during the mid-1800s and decreed that the Dartmouth propriety was dissolved, and that common land still owned by the propriety within the borders of each of those present towns and city would henceforth belong to the local municipal governments. Need arose in the 19th century for more schools, police and fire stations, municipal offices, more roads, and most urgently, land for municipal water supplies. Some landowners may have made donations of land, as they still do today. Some land may have been taken for non-payment of municipal taxes, and other parcels by eminent domain. But the truth is that municipal governments came into more power, and the Dartmouth propriety by 1800 was in decline and overpowered by the realities it faced. It faded away to nothing but an empty shell of its former self. And this is not up on the screen, but this is the current town of Dartmouth. And if you can just notice in purple, I was not able to get it for Fairhaven, but I got it for Dartmouth. The purple denotes town-owned land, and you can see there's a lot of it. This is a central part of what was old Dartmouth. Now, a lot of these were donated. A lot of them were donated because they're wetlands, and you can't build on wetlands, so you don't want to pay taxes on it, so you give it to the town. Some by eminent domain. Some people didn't pay their town taxes, which of course came in after the propriety. You had to pay the municipal taxes. One final postscript, and again, this is also not up on the screen, but several weeks ago, I contacted the office of Massachusetts Representative Paul Schmidt of Westport. And I said, I'm giving a talk on the propriety. What can you tell me? Can you look in the 1800s and figure out how this all ended? Because we don't know. I'm going to read just a little bit, a couple of lines from what Paul had someone in his office working on this. And here is their conclusion at the state level. Librarians and archivists at both the State House and State Archives have reached a similar conclusion. Both sets of folks believe that your research is completely accurate and that the propriety and its disbandment was sometime in the 1800s. The one thing neither group could ascertain, however, was the exact date or period in which the disbandment occurred. Nobody could find documentation regarding how they went about doing it. Most archivists and historians believe that as time went on, the need for the propriety simply wasn't needed, and ownership of the land reverted back to more private stakeholders. Now, private stakeholders, those would be the shareholders if they were left. Of course, I think you could also probably gather that by this time, by the 1800s, the same people running the propriety were very much in control of running the town. But we really don't have an answer. And my only final, if anybody in the audience comes up with an answer, let me know. And the one curious thing for me is that I mentioned James Cognan earlier. In 1867, he got a directive from the top down, from the state, down through the Bristol County Commissioners, and then down to the local Registry of Deeds, which is where this guy worked for Bristol County. And he was asked to figure out, what have you got for proprietors' records? And it's because he stepped in the 1860s, and he didn't touch the proprietor's book, the corporate meeting records, which I did later, almost more than 100 years later. But he did preserve, and that's the cursive writing that you see in the books they're on our website, volumes A and B, of the actual proprietors describing what they owned and where they got their shares, how much they owned, which division it was in, and so on. And these are in those 4 books that Cognan saved, and he transcribed them, and then Dan has made an index for them and put them on the website, so that people who really want to trace back and find out what their relatives owned can find that nowadays. And of course, these records are available probably in more sources than just the website, but they are there. So that is my talk, and if anybody has any questions, either now or afterwards.
By talking about a few of the family connections that Mercy Delano, Lieutenant Jonathan's wife, had to other people in the area. And then in a little bit, I'll get into the land records themselves in Fairhaven. This is a monument to Colonel Benjamin Church in Little Compton Commons Cemetery. This is Mercy Delano's first cousin. He was the leader, or a leader, of colonial forces during King Philip's War. Many years after the war, he wrote something called the Diary of King Philip's War, which he dictated to his son Thomas. And in there, Benjamin Church mentions Lieutenant Jonathan Delano several times. Most notably, it's in reference to an episode they had at the Great Cedar Swamp, which is over near New Bedford Airport. And Church's command was made up at the time of a company of Englishmen and a company of Indians that he had recruited. And he decided that they would search for Indians, hostile Indians in the area, and they would split up with the Indians going one way and the English company going the other. And he says that Lieutenant Delano was someone who was familiar with the ground and who spoke the Indian language. Now, saying he was familiar with the ground suggests to me that, indeed, Jonathan Delano was probably living in this area before 1675. But in that event, Benjamin Church was on horseback. He keeps riding through the Cedar Swamp. They meet up at the ruined house of John Cook, which is in Fairhaven, just a little north of where you come over the bridge for 195. And they were going to meet the Indian company and the company of English. But when they're still in the Cedar Swamp, Benjamin Church finds himself, looks around, and there's about 100 Indians around him. And he doesn't know how to speak the language, and he turns around and there's no white men behind him. And fortunately for him, Lieutenant Delano rides up, and it says he calls out to the Indians in their language, so they're able to understand that they don't have a hostile intent. And the episode goes on, and involves the Indians raiding at the Sconnecut Neck and what have you. But it shows that Lieutenant Delano's involvement with the Benjamin Church. Next spot. This is the gravestone itself of Benjamin Church, kind of an unusual above ground large slate slab. At the top, his gravestone is on the right, his wife is on the left. On the top of his gravestone is a U.S. Army Ranger badge. The Rangers, about 20 years ago, had a ceremony in which they acknowledged they consider Benjamin Church the founder of their branch of the service. So in effect, Lieutenant Delano was a officer in the first, the original Ranger battalion, if you will.
What cemetery is this in?
This is a Little Compton Commons.
Okay.
Next. This is Benjamin Church's neighbor, sort of neighbor in the cemetery, and real life next door neighbor, Elizabeth Alden Peabody. This is the same cemetery. According to the monument, first white woman born in New England, daughter of John Alden, Priscilla Mullins. This monument was erected in the 1880s. You can show the next slide, Bob. This is the original gravestone, original slate gravestone. Until that time, I've never seen in Little Compton records or Westport records, what have you, which I'm most familiar with, any references to people having Mayflower descents or anything like that. But it caught on about the 1870s, 1880s, and when it caught on, people went into it hammer and tongs. There was a dispute that arose in the case of Elizabeth Alden Peabody. There were two families, the Grays and the Wilburs, and each owned a house, still in existence, both houses, which they claimed to be the real Betty Alden house where they lived. And they were neighbors, and the dispute was so vociferous that for decades and decades, the Grays and the Wilburs wouldn't speak to each other. And it turns out in the long run, they were probably both right. She lived in the Wilbur version of the Betty Alden house while she was married, and the Gray version she lived in later when she lived with her son after she was a widow. Benjamin Church, whose house is long out of existence, would have lived just to the south. Next. This is Benjamin's brother, Joseph Church, also, of course, a first cousin of Mercy Delano. Joseph Church's grandson, Nathaniel, is the one who kind of started the Fairhaven branch of the Church family. And Nathaniel ended up purchasing the homestead farm of Jabez Delano in 1736. And then Nathaniel's great-granddaughter, Deborah Perry Church, became the wife of Warren Delano the first.
Look at how they messed up and didn't spell it right first, and then they put the little P on top.
Yeah, they had the lettering of those days was peculiar. It means yeah, here it lieth ye body, but they put the E on top and things like that. But, the gravestone carvers were not terribly skilled in those days, too, you know, and that may have played a role. You know, it's some of the old Puritan iconography. I forget, Al Lees or somebody like that could probably tell me what those discs mean around. Yeah, there's a death angel at the top, which is supposed to assist the soul in its ascension. Okay, next. This is at Warren's Point in Little Compton. This house was built by Mercy Delano's brother, Nathaniel Warren Jr., who only lived here for about 15 years and had no descendants, and yet for some reason the whole area is still called Warren's Point more than 300 years later. He bought up a lot of properties in Little Compton. Little Compton Historical Society, about 4 years ago, we had a house tour, and there were 10 properties on the tour, not including this one. And Marjorie O'Toole, who wrote an accompanying book, searched the title for all 10 properties. 6 of the 10 properties were owned by Nathaniel Warren at one time. Next. This is the plaque. It's on the side of the house. 1685. It's a little early. Probably 1690, I would say, more likely. Certainly before 1698, when he left Little Compton. What's the other? Oh, Reverend Ray Palmer, he wrote the hymn, My Faith Looks Up to Thee, in this house in 1830. Next. This is Old Stone Baptist Church in Tiverton, Adamsville, really just over the old Dartmouth line, about a mile or so, right on the Tiverton, Little Compton line. This building dates from 1841, but there was a church here, a wooden church just behind where this building was, that dated from probably, even possibly the late 1600s, certainly by the early 1700s. There's a tradition of the early members of this church that the church was founded by John Cook. I've talked about this with some other people. I don't think that's literally true, but John Cook, who we know in Fairhaven, who was a Baptist, probably kind of the spiritual founder, almost the founder of the congregation was. Physically, I don't see reason to think that he was over here. But unquestionably, John Cook's grandson, who was Philip Tabor Jr., was the longtime minister of this church in the early 1700s. Philip Tabor Jr. was both the minister of the church, he was also a justice of peace. You look in old Dartmouth vital records for the marriages, I would venture to guess he performed more marriages than anybody else in the history of Dartmouth in one of those two capacities. Okay, next. This is Gray's Grist Mill in Adamsville, right on the Westport, Little Compton border. Terry Delano's former place of employment. When he worked for old John Hart, turns out we know some of the same people.
Unpaid positions.
With probably just the way John would have liked it.
You know it.
But this mill, the mill was built in 1877, but this mill is on a site of a much earlier mill that was built by Philip Tabor, who was another of Mercy Delano's first cousins. He was the son-in-law of John Cook. You can go to the next slide. This is the plaque You see down at the bottom, original site, the Philip Tabor Mill, circa 1675. Again, a little Compton, they go a little wild on dates, probably 1690. Certainly before 1692 when he died. But in any event, they've been grinding Johnny cake meal on this site for over 300 years, which I'm sure must be a record. In the early to mid 1800s, yet another kind of Delano connection. It was owned by the Church brothers, Samuel Ebenezer Church. They had been born in Fairhaven, and Warren Delano, the first, was their brother-in-law. It was their sister that was married to Delano. They're the ones who, that family sold it to the Grays in just before they built this new mill in 1877. And the last Delano connection, which I didn't find out until 2 days ago where that name comes from. It actually comes from Terry's sister, which is the brook that feeds the mill pond for that mill, Rocky Delano Brook. So that's just a little start to give us a little tour, if you will, around the area to show some of Mercy Delano's family connection. So that concludes the fun and interesting part of my talk, and I'll go on now to talk about the old dusty land records and see if we can find some of Jonathan Delano's early properties. There we go. So as I mentioned, Jonathan Delano clearly, to my mind, is in Fairhaven. When I say Fairhaven, I'm using the modern reference points. Obviously, at the time, it was all part of Dartmouth. But he was in Fairhaven certainly before King Philip's War. The first land record that mentions him is in 1678, but I think he was here before that time. And the record in 1678, oh, one other reason I say that. In Jeremy Bang's book on Indian land deeds, if you look in there, you'll find a couple of references to Jonathan Delano, one of which he is called to testify in Plymouth in 1673 with Arthur Hathaway, who are called as witnesses. The Indians at the time, this is before King Philip's War, are settled between the Sippacan River and the east boundary of Dartmouth, which is in this area. Hathaway and Delano are called as witnesses who are said to be familiar with where that boundary is. So he probably was, in order to be familiar with it, it's a fair presumption that he was living in the area by that time. The purchase in 1678 is a purchase of 2 acres of good meadow and a 1/4 acre of mean meadow from Samuel Cuthbert. I don't know where that is. The meadow is really, when you see meadow in the old records, think salt marsh. They used to mow the hay off that because supposedly if you mow it in the fall, it'll keep growing even over the winter, and it's a good source of forage. The first deeds for farmland that I found are both in 1681, both from John Cook. The first to Lieutenant Jonathan Delano of Dartmouth. Jonathan Delano is called the carpenter in that deed. A 1/6 part of a whole share of Dartmouth land, being the 35th part of the whole. So that's a 1/6 share. At the same time, he buys a specific 71-acre parcel from Cook, and that lies, it says, betwixt the homesteads of John Cook and Thomas Tabor, where they now dwell, and it reserves to Cook a convenient way over said Delano's upland through gates or bars in order to cart his hay to his own lands. John Cook had meadow lots down at Marsh Island, which is the area, if you're coming over 195 into Fairhaven, you look to your right, that's basically Marsh Island. And so he was carting hay over Delano's land to get to his homestead. And a lot of the subsequent deeds, you see the same right reserved to the successors in title, if you will,
Sir, how big a patch was that?
71 acres when, as of 1681.
Thank you.
These, and then the next deed, also from John Cook, was in 1691. This is a gift from John Cook to Jonathan Delano. In consideration of the goodwill I bear to Jonathan Delano and for other good causes, a 1/4 share of upland and meadow in Dartmouth lands, plus 25 acres of upland purchased by the grantor from John Russell. I don't know where the John Russell piece is. Well, I'm not even going to venture a guess. I'll just say I don't know where that one is. But so he buys, or he was given an additional 1/4 share in 1691. None of these deeds were filed in the right place, which is maybe a reason why I don't think too many people, maybe no one has come across them before. They're filed in Plymouth. They don't belong there. All this land is in Bristol County. It has to be filed over here. But that's where they still are, is in Plymouth, Plymouth records. Now in 1697, Jonathan Delano sold the parcel, 71-acre parcel that was next to John Cook. He sold that to Lieutenant William Spooner. And at the time, it's noted that the northern abutter is Sarah Cook, widow of John. Tabor still to the south. Undivided land is still out to the east, and Marsh is to the west. In 1725, Spooner sells it to Thomas Nye. At that time, Stephen West is the abutter to the north, who's the son-in-law of John Cook, took over the homestead, and Stephen West gets the right to cart hay over the upland. And to make a long story short, it goes from the Nyes, 4 generations of the Nyes, Thomas Nye Sr., Thomas Nye Jr., then to his son Obed Nye, and then to his son Jonathan Nye, until 1839, when the Delanos come back into the picture. Warren Delano II buys the property, and the western part, he has a house apparently on the eastern part. I don't know if this map goes quite that far north. Wait a minute.
It's right on Little Bay. It's right on Little Bay about the way the letter E is.
No, I'm talking about Warren Delano II. It's a house on Adams Street, west side of Adams
that
Street.
one, okay.
Yeah, it's farther north.
But he also had that other part, because my grandfather, I have records where my grandfather, Warren Delano Warren Delano bought that piece of property on Little Bay, and he built a house for his brother Ephraim and his other brother.
Yeah, I'm not at Nescatucket yet. You'll have to
You're not
hold
there.
on.
Okay, cool.
I'm north of Nescatucket. I'll get to Nescatucket eventually.
Okay, now we're up
I'm
at
gonna
where?
I'm gonna finish up with
We're on
Oxford
Adams
first.
Street?
Is that far enough north for you, or do you want to go?
I wonder if you can see. I don't know if I looked for it on this map. Yeah, right there. Yeah, right here. W. Delano, Warren Delano. So he built a house. This is Adams Street. I think it's on the west side of Adams Street. But see, on the western part of his property, that's Riverside Cemetery. That's what he used to found Riverside Cemetery. So, which is a place I'm sure many of you have probably been. But when you go there in the future, not only is it sort of the final resting place for the Delanos, but it's also kind of the initial resting place for Jonathan when he came to Old Dartmouth. Now I'm going to move to Nescatucket. Like I said, in 1697, he sold that
Gotcha.
until it comes back into Delano possession in 1839. Bob Harding found a record in the town records. I'm sure he'll mention it. I don't know if there's some sort of a notice for a town meeting or something like that in 1695, which specified various places around town where they had to post the notice. And one of them said it had to be posted at Jonathan Delano's mill. And I know other people have been interested in the mill, and they usually focus on the grist mill. And the grist mill is right up there, right by that pond. The grist mill really doesn't have a connection to Jonathan Delano, but it's very close to where he did have a sawmill rather than a grist mill. The grist mill was built between 1757 and 1765. It was written about by Henry Worth, who was a historian and lawyer in New Bedford. He wrote in 1915. The other watermill in Fairhaven was on Nascatucket Brook, a few yards north of the Mattapoisett Road. The stream extended through the ancient farm of Lettice Jenny, and this section passed to his son Cornelius in 1757. The latter conveyed to George Badcock land on the brook near the old sawmill dam. Although apparently the site of an earlier mill, yet this is the first mention of the fact. It's one of the very few instances where I can say I know more about the land history than Henry Worth did. The sawmill is at the very northwest corner of Lieutenant Jonathan Delano's property. It's north of the road, and it's probably just on the east side, just across from the grist mill. The writing is on the east side, but the actual dot showing where the mill is, it was on the west side. So it's probably just on the east side of the river. The mill must have been in existence of 1695, but curiously, it isn't mentioned in any of the wills I've seen from Lieutenant Jonathan. It is mentioned in a deed from his son Nathaniel, who sells part of the homestead farm. He said, remember, Nathaniel inherited the part that had the house on it too. The house is on the south side of, I'll just say, Route 6, the highway to Mattapoisett, which is pretty close to the course of the modern Route 6. Although keep in mind, back in the old times, that road only started in effect at Nascatucket. It didn't proceed westerly into Fairhaven. It went from the Nascatucket over to Mattapoisett village. But in 1748, when Nathaniel Delano sold a portion of the homestead, it says it includes 1/8 part of the sawmill that stands within or near said bounds, with 1/8 of the implements to said mill. So when he says within or near said bounds, he's either uncertain of where his boundary is, or he's uncertain of where the mill is. And I think it's more likely the latter. I think it had already fallen into such disuse by the 1740s that it was no longer operational. But it makes sense that a family that is kind of has several carpenters in it would have use for a mill. As I mentioned, Lieutenant Jonathan is called the carpenter in 2 deeds. Jabez is always called a carpenter. Jonathan Jr. is always called either carpenter or house carpenter. The others, just to finish them out, Thomas is always called a mariner. Nathaniel is a yeoman, who's a farmer. Jethro is a gentleman, which is not a gentleman in the English lord sense or something, but it means that his primary occupation was something other than farming. But so the mill, he may have come down sometime around 1695 to operate the mill. He has a house, Lieutenant Jonathan, on the south side of the road. We know that because in 1704 he gives a deed for love and affection to his son Jonathan Jr. 100 acres of upland lying on the southerly side of the highway that now leads from my now dwelling house into Mattapoisett. And it's to begin at the easterly end, so it's east of where the land senior retains. And he gives meadow and salt marsh. And also he gives him the west end of my dwelling house, as is the new end that was last built. So as of 1704, he's just built the west end of a dwelling house, and which implies that the east end had been there for some time prior. Also, it's not exactly a free and clear gift. Jonathan Jr. agrees to pay his mother £5 per year in the event that she became a widow. Now, this deed is modified by a deed in 1719, a year before Lieutenant Jonathan's death, of Jonathan Jr. to Jonathan Sr., who conveys back 20 acres of upland and the west part of the dwelling house. And in exchange for that, he's excused now from having to give his mother, pay his mother £5 per year when she becomes a widow. Now we know that Jonathan Jr. moved away in 1722, and from this deed I would say he probably was already contemplating moving away. It would be consistent with that. So, Jonathan has a net 80 acres. It's on the south side of Route 6. On the north side of Route 6, in the same year, 1704, Jonathan Delano, for love and affection, the son Jabez, 80 acres of upland at the north side of the highway from Granner's dwelling house to Manapoiset, plus 3 acres of salt marsh, 1/16 of a share of undivided land after the 800-acre division. So Jabez has 80 acres on the north side of the road, about up in here. The situation is complicated a little bit because Jabez also has a second farm that he bought from Samuel Hicks, 181 acres. It would have encompassed this area right here. Where you see these Delanos here on this map, that's actually on the footprint of the old Samuel Hicks Jabez Delano farm. That's the farm that I showed Joseph Church in the cemetery. His grandson Nathaniel bought that farm, and then Nathaniel Church sells it to yet another Little Compton person, the William Shaw. Shaw then sells it to Jethro Delano, who about a year later, he then sells it to his nephew, Ephraim Delano. And that's with the two Delanos shown here, E. Delano and T.R. Delano. That's Ephraim III, Thomas Rudolphus Delano, who are still living there. You can see them on the 1850 census. So from that point, it goes from Ephraim I, Ephraim II, and so on. Jabez died in 1734, so he had accumulated quite a bit of land. The southern part, which was down here, 181 acres he had bought from Hicks. The northern part, which would be up around this area, 232 acres, which he sold to Israel Tupper. Jonathan Jr. moved to Connecticut, 1722. He's really, I think, probably just east of Whedon Road. Whedon Road probably divided the north end of Whedon Road at the intersection. Divides Jonathan Jr. to the east and Nathaniel to the west. Jonathan Jr. sold his parcel in 1722 to Joseph Russell, who was from Joseph Russell Jr., who's a prominent New Bedford family. I think it's his son, if I'm not mistaken, probably Joseph Russell III, who's generally acknowledged kind of the founder of the whaling industry in New Bedford. Thomas inherited land from his father that was right in here. Just right around where the railroad is, railroad cut there is later on, probably just a bit, maybe on both sides of that. Thomas sold his property in really 3 pieces, but he sold 21 acres to his brother Nathaniel. He sells 5 acres to Moses Sherman. The main part with a house on it, he sells to Elnathan Aldrich, in 1736. Aldrich's widow, Deliverance Aldrich, later years becomes the second wife of Jethro. Jethro's land, I'm not sure exactly where it is, but I think it's probably right in here. It's certainly west of Thomas, although the will suggests that Jethro's land is going to be south of Thomas. It's the two brothers have a division deed in the 1720s in which instead of being stacked north and south, they're actually divided now east and west. By the 1740s, Jethro is living down here. He's very close to the area where we're going to be tomorrow night. He's on the south side of what they call the driftway, so like a private road to Nakata Island, which is West Island. And
Actually, he's in a grave down in Wilbur's Point.
well,
Yeah.
I'm using the present tense
I mean, that's where he
a
ended
little
up.
loosely.
Wilbur's Point, yeah.
I mean,
Not
No, he's
literally
gone to
hanging out
heaven.
waiting for us.
so anyway, by the 1740s, he's down here. I think this Bessie here, I think is actually a descendant or relative or something of Jethro, and he's down here. This land really that he has on Sconticut Neck doesn't come from Lieutenant Jonathan. This comes from independent purchases. The largest, 127 acres down in this area, down in the south end, but he purchases land up and down Sconticut Neck. He has two houses that are mentioned in the 1740s, both on the driftway that goes over to Nakata Island, which I presume is an area up called Jacob's Neck area somewhere. The first one is to the east, and the second one is to the west. And one other property I'll mention on Sconticut Neck, which is very interesting because of who buys it, and that's the part that Jonathan Delano, Lieutenant Jonathan, had, and he leaves to his son Nathaniel under the will. And in 1742, Nathaniel sells that parcel to John Simon, an Indian man of Little Compton. I know a little bit about John Simon, and actually I know too about his father, William Simon. Well, it says Little Compton. He didn't literally live in Little Compton. He really lived in what was part of Little Compton at the time, which later became part of Westport, down in the Ocoxit section of Westport. Interesting, if you look on a modern map in that area from the south end of Old Harbor Road, you see a little brook that's, those are my batteries, a little brook that goes down, traverses that in Brayton Point Road down into Richmond Pond, and that is still called, all these years later, Simon's Brook. It's named for him or his father. Well, they're both Indian preachers. And so in 1742, he moved to Sconticut Neck, to the old Delano property, and then John Simon had a son, Thomas, who lived there for a while, and then Thomas Simon had a daughter, Martha Simon. She's the M. Simon, shown on this, shown about halfway up the neck, right in there. And Martha Simon was the subject of an Alfred Bierstadt painting in 1857 that is in possession of the library. I don't know if they have this library. I don't know if they have it on display or not, but it's called the Last of the Narragansetts, which is kind of a misnomer because she was a Wampanoag for sure, not a Narragansett. But in 1856, she was interviewed by Henry David Thoreau, who was over to visit his friend Daniel Ricketson over in New Bedford. And he says she was born on that spot, meaning her land on Sconticut Neck. Her grandfather also lived on the same spot, although in a different house. He was the last of his race who could speak Indian. She had heard him pray in Indian, but could only understand the words Jesus Christ. As I mentioned, both her grandfather and great-grandfather were Indian preachers over in Coxa. Thoreau went on, the land was formerly exchanged by a white man for some better land then occupied by Indians in Westport. I won't get it, there's more, Thoreau doesn't have more details, but from my own knowledge I have some more details. It didn't involve the Delano in any sort of negative way. It was engineered by the farmers who lived around there in Westport, the two Richmond brothers, to kind of get rid of the Indians. And I think they put up the money for him to go live over on Sconnecut Neck with the idea that he was going to abandon the land down in Westport that was taken over by the Richmonds. So in any event, that's kind of my little tour of some of the connections and some of the early land transactions. Anybody has any questions? Yes?
What is your source for the, you mentioned carpenter and farmer and
Well, early deeds would typically mention the occupation of the grantor and the grantee. And it did this up until about 1800 or so. Not always, but usually.
And then in the census, they always included that, even in the 1800s, yeah.
Yeah, but of course I'm talking in the early 1700s, they really didn't have the equivalent. That's why the deeds can be useful
Yeah.
for
so
determining.
the information basically all comes from the deed record.
Yes,
Thank you.
I think that's true of almost everything. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
You said it was John Simon the preacher and his son Thomas Simon, who was Martha Simon's father, I mean.
Right, it goes from Martha Simon, Thomas Simon, John Simon, then William Simon was the first.
Williamson.
And that area in the map that you had drawn in orange, is that present-day Fairhaven?
Yes, yes, everything on the right of the picture is Fairhaven, on the left is New Bedford.
Thank you.
Sure.
Is the drift, what is called the drift in your top, is that where the causeway is now, right?
Yeah, a driftway was very common terminology. It really just means a private road. They use that in all these towns around here.
I think that's where
I
they
don't.
used
I don't know if it follows, Goulart Memorial Road, Causeway Road, what have you. But I mean, that would be the logical place. It certainly is an east-west road because he says it's on the south side of it.
My grandfather would say that before the causeway was built, they would drive the cattle over there, the cows over there, all the livestock over there. They would make them swim over to West Island for the summer.
Sure, sure. They used to, and I've talked about this elsewhere, the Slocum family who lived in South Dartmouth, they owned the Cuttyhunk, Nashawina, Noshawn. They used to put the sheep, and they had
Yeah.
like thousands of sheep. They used to put the sheep on boats in the springtime. And the sheep would go out to the islands. They were the original kind of summer residents of those islands up there.
Yeah.
And they go out there, and of course sheep will eat the hell out of everything. They eat down to nothing. And the winter, it's very windy. It's very inhospitable out there. You can ask people who live out there nowadays, even now, when it has some trees. But on those islands, so they bring the sheep in the winter. They're on the mainland in the winter. They're out on the islands in the summer. So those are, I'm sure, the common practice. And sometimes the flats, what we used to call flats that you see in the river, the pieces of salt marsh, like over in the Westport River right now. Yeah, they drive the cattle out there and have them eat the grass. Anybody else?
Richard, thank you very much.
For commercial, I represent the Dartmouth History and Art Society, a local history and art society. We have a terrific website. The map you were just referring to was right off of our website live. We have membership brochures if you're interested in getting actively involved in history and genealogy. And we have meetings about every other week on Sundays at the Russell's Mills Schoolhouse. So that's my commercial. You can turn the volume back up again. I'm very happy to be here today. It's one of the passions of my life to be involved in history and genealogy. And I'm very happy to share some of the work I've been doing as a result of being invited to speak here. This is an honor for me to be here, and I'm very grateful to all of you for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about the Delanos, as they are mentioned in some archival records that have not been very generally available. And I did a lot of work making these records available to the general public, and I've now done some research on the Delanos in these records. I'm not a Delano scholar by any stretch, and you'll see that I don't recognize all of the names that I found, but I did find them, and I know the Delanos from the documentation, but it'll be up to you to help me make connections with what I found. And I'm going to try to, I've got a lot of slides. Everything I do is going to be on our website within a few days, so that you can see it and spend some time looking at it. But some of it's in great detail, and I know we're at the end of the day, and it gets a little long, even with really interesting stuff like we've all had. But I'll try to keep it pretty crisp and speedy. I'll dwell a little bit on some of the things I think might be of more general interest, and not just a scholarly finding a record kind of a thing. So here we go. First I gotta make the slide move.
Yeah, what have I done wrong?
Anyway, I want to give you a little overview and then an outline. And I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you a few times.
Yes, thank you.
First, I'm going to talk about some background about Dartmouth. There it is. Okay, forget it. So here's the overview. Material, my talk today is going to be a combination of material from an earlier work, which I called at the time, in 2014, Revelations, Surprises, and Te Deum in the town meeting records of Old Dartmouth. There's a lot of Te Deum in these old records, but we won't get into that. With some original research in these old Dartmouth town meeting records, that's ODTMRSs, done exclusively for this meeting.
Wheel here, because I don't think those are set up as slides.
Okay. The outline of what I want to cover, first I want to talk about an introduction to the old Dartmouth geography and its divisions as it was subdivided. Then I'm going to talk about the town meeting records and improvements in their accessibility over the years since they were originally written by the various clerks of the town meeting. And then I'm going to show you the extracts and transcriptions of some of the extracts from those town meeting records. And I'm going to show you a few of surprises. Life was different then in the old days. I'll leave it with you.
Okay.
Next slide, please. Okay, the first part, an introduction. And I'm doing this because I want you to understand that in the old town meeting records, the language was different. Some common words had different meanings, and I really got to make sure you understand that. Next slide. The old town was, we're going to talk about the old town, of course, was successively divided over time until what had been one town, after 4 different subdivisions, ended up as a collection of Cushnet, Dartmouth, Fairhaven, New Bedford, and Westport. We alluded to that. This is what the original town looked like. You're all familiar with that. Forgive me, my hand coloring, I'm not a good colorer. I hand colored that. The first division was on 22 February 1787, and that divided the old town into 2, Dartmouth and New Bedford. And New Bedford in those days was a lot bigger than it is now. Next slide, please. The second division divided Westport off of Dartmouth, as it had been subdivided from the old Dartmouth. And that's what it looked like. And that's a familiar picture because we're going to be seeing that picture again later. Next division was the third division. This is when New Bedford itself was subdivided into Fairhaven and New Bedford. And Fairhaven at that time included what we now call Acushnet, next division finished the job. We got it down to the all 5 that we have. So that's a quick overview with the dates that divided up the old Dartmouth. Next slide, please. Now, what the consequences of that mean this, that a Delano family living in a physical location, the southeast section of the town, the section that Richard was showing you earlier, would be recorded as residents of 3 different towns over time as the boundaries were changed. They may not have moved, the house would be same foundation, but if there are records made in that period of time, it would be recorded at different places. If you're looking for records, you need to know when you're looking, what time of history in which town to look in to find where they are. Our excursion into the town meeting records is going to stop before any of those divisions. That make life easy. It's all Dartmouth during the period when we're examining the town meeting records. Now, the word village, sometimes spelled village, like it sounds, they were very practical, those old Yankees. In the old Dartmouth town meeting records, it does not mean a hamlet or a small settlement like you think of it today. It's not like Acushnet Village at the head of the Acushnet River, or Russell's Mills Village, or Smith Mills, Musconic Neck, or whatever. It's not like that. What it meant was more like we mean by the word town, the whole expanse of area. Next slide, please. When they are referring in the old Dartmouth town meeting records to village, and they use the word a lot, and they assign offices of the town a lot according to where you live, which village you lived in. These were the villages like this, just like it was at one point during the division. This was New Bedford, Dartmouth, and Westport. And they were called in those days, in the earliest times, in the 1600s, it was Cushina, we call it Acushnet, Onagansett, and Cookson. Later they put an A on the front, and later they changed the name to either Nokochoke or Westport or Onagansett or Dartmouth or New Bedford, Fairhaven, or Acushnet. But that's the nomenclature that was very common through these old Dartmouth town meeting records. Now let's talk about the second part of my outline. The town meeting records and improvements in their accessibility. Of course, town meeting records then as now are a record of what business is transacted in the town meeting. We run towns by town meeting or representative town meetings now. In those days, anyone qualified to be a town meeting member came to town meeting. It wasn't representative, it was all qualified landholding people. And up until 1888, the town meeting records were in the vaults of the town of Dartmouth's town clerk. And sometime in 1888, the Board of Aldermen in the city of New Bedford decided, they passed a little resolution to make an investigation and check up and report on the condition of the public records of the original town of Dartmouth, of which New Bedford was a part, of course. Next slide. And they did that. They sent somebody over to Dartmouth, and they got cooperation from the town clerk of Dartmouth, a guy named Gifford, I believe his name was. And I tell Richard that everybody, if it was anybody around Dartmouth, was always named Gifford. They found out they were in very dilapidated condition. This is a quote. Some of them were missing and so on. So in June of 1888, the New Bedford City Council, on recommendation of this committee that was examining the records, appropriated money to copy these designated records and put them in an improved condition. And they hired a lady named Etta Martin as their copyist, the woman who had good handwriting and could transcribe these records from all these different handwritings that she found and misspellings and everything else, so you can read them, make them legible. And let's go back to that one. She performed a terrific service for all of us who are interested in these records. First of all, she deciphered some pretty crummy writing. If you've ever read old records, you know it's not easy to read it. And the spelling was just, you had to guess what they meant. It was so bad in some cases. And she transcribed all of this into crisp, clear, handwritten transcription, but still handwritten. She also corrected but noted misspelled words. A lot of researchers are very critical about using transcriptions of original records because they're all full of errors, they change things. She did try, not on every record, but she did try to correctly spell the intended word of the original copy, the original scribe. But she would note the original spelling in the margin of the record. So we have both, the original spelling and her interpretation. And more useful maybe than all of this, she created indexes to the various record sets. The record sets are what, I'm using modern language, the record sets would be, they had vital records, marriages, deaths, births. They also had the highway layouts, according to their layouts from the black oak tree to the rock and the meadow and stuff like that, as well as the town meeting records. So she has indexes. So I mean, want to find the word Duval or Delano, I got Duval, another good old Yankee name from old Dartmouth.
Yeah.
But Delano, you go in and find where it is, but then you got to go read it and transcribe it and make it legible for you to read. So she did great service. Also, in this first improvement, I'm just trying to give you the picture of the availability of these records to researchers. From 1888, after she did this transcription, anybody researching old town meeting records could research them using her transcription, but you had to go to the city hall in New Bedford and get a pass and go in the back and get the book and open it up and read it. That's how you get to read the old town meeting records up until 1969.
Yeah.
Then in 1969, the second improvement came. The Genealogical Society of Salt Lake City in Utah, as you know, associated with the Mormon Church, it's part of a long-term program that's still going, filmed. The program is to film and preserve primary records. I think you all know about the background of the Mormons and how they can be baptized for somebody who's dead to save their soul and all that. They really believe it's important to know the family so you can be saved according to their religion. And so they're big on genealogy. They preserve records. They've been a godsend to all of us genealogists and historians because they've got a lot of good records that they've saved. And so they filmed these transcriptions along with all the other original records of Dartmouth and New Bedford, Fairhaven, Westport, and everybody else all around the area. Put them on microfilm, and you could buy, next slide please, you could buy those microfilm reels if you wanted them, and actually go take it where there's a microfilm reader, roll through it, find the stuff, write it down. That's what lots of us did back in the days before computers and stuff like that. We went rolling through microfilm. Before that, you had to go to the books. Well, there's microfilm. Some of us did that too, but it's getting a lot easier these days, and we're making it easier for the work we're doing. Later on, the Mormon Church digitized these films, and digitizing, I should clarify, what I mean here by digitizing is not like engineering digitizing a drawing or something else where you convert the thing into a ASCII file. They're just putting into a computer processable form the photographs, it's like a JPEG image. Those of you who are computer types. So you can look at it on a computer. You don't need a microfilm reader. But it's a lot easier on a computer to reel by a whole bunch of photographs. So that was a big improvement also. Next slide, please. The third improvement. I happen to be a member of the Dartmouth Historic Commission, as well as the president of the Dartmouth Historical and Art Society. As a member of the commission, I sought the vote of the board, the commission, Dartmouth Historic Commission, to be authorized by them to do something about these transcriptions of the Dartmouth town meeting records. I got their authorization, so I went out and I tried to borrow the New Bedford Free Public Library, that's the acronym NBFPL, New Bedford Free Public Library's copy, because I knew they had one. I had seen it. I'd rolled through the microfilm that they had there, that they had gotten from the Mormon Church. They politely refused to let me borrow their microfilm, but they suggested that they would help me purchase a copy of that film from the Mormon Church, the agency of the Mormon Church, if I wanted to use their purchasing system to do it. So I said, sure, I'll do that. And they sent away, and I gave them money, and when it came in, I picked it up. So next slide, please. I did a little research and found a local firm that you could convert this microfilm film, which is just a roll of like you put in a microfilm thing, could convert it to computer file, a bunch of JPEG images for each image on the microfilm. And I had that done, and I have that, and it's available. It was available to me then to load onto my computer from a disk. So I got the next slide, please. Once I had it on my disk, Dartmouth History and Art Society has a very nice website, which you've heard me bragging about all day long, and I'm going to continue to push it as I move through this. I highly recommend it. Our webmaster is here filming us put these meetings on our website, and his name is Dan Socia. He's in my book, a genius, because I can't do any of that stuff. All I can do is push buttons, and I can't even do that. I got charged for that. But we now have the town meeting records of the town of Old Dartmouth up until 1787 available on our website. So you can read what I've been reading to do the rest of what I'm going to show you today. Okay, so this is our website. That's the link. All you need to put in is dartmouthhas.org on your computer, and go looking for that with Google, and you'll find our website. And I'm not going to give you a tour of the website. I could, but I haven't got time. But it's very well done, so it's quite natural how to use it. There's a table of contents. There's all kinds of stuff there, from archival stuff, old records, to maps. You saw some of the maps. We have genealogies, we have photographs, we have meetings like this, all kinds of stuff like that. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to step 3 in my outline. Extracts and transcriptions, the Delano name, the old Dartmouth Town Meeting records. First, I want to talk a little bit about the format and the nomenclature so you can better understand the tables I'm going to show you. I'm going to be presenting tables of these extracts in the transcriptions from the old town meeting records. And it's going to be based on a sequence of the date in the town meeting record when they occurred. And I'm organizing these things by the name of the Delano who was named in the town meeting records. And the name that was mentioned first in the town meeting records will be the first one there. And I'll have all of his records, then I'll have the one with the next earliest date and all of his records, and the next, and the next, and the next, until we finally get up into the Revolutionary period and the end of the old Dartmouth town meeting records, because it became Dartmouth and New Bedford. And that will be a guy named Richard Delano. I don't know who Richard Delano is. Some of you genealogists who are Delano genealogists might know which Richard Delano. He's only there once. And several of the other names are really probably another name for one who's named more frequently, and you can combine them for you. But any distinct first name I have distinct. I didn't combine them. I don't believe in writing history. I believe in recording what I can find is well documented. So this is the header for each person is going to give us the given name of the Delano being recorded, followed by the first year in which a record that name appears, followed by the last year that name appears. I have a little summary before we get into the table of all the actual records. Next slide, please. Column by column in the table, we have a page. The page will give you the page number of the old Dartmouth Town Meeting record, which is actually inscribed on the pages that are on our website, where you will find the Delano name that I'm referring to. The year, month, and day refers to the actual date of the Dartmouth Town Meeting record where the name was found. So it's a clerk's record of the town meeting that took place on that day. Then the text either renders the title of the office or the function that this person had assigned to them or voted by the town meeting, or it's a literal transcription of what is written in the town meeting record. Next slide, please. Jonathan, of course, was the first one, and he's the guy that lived down there on Sonic Neck. And he's the one who had the grist mill. And this summary is kind of a summary of all the different offices that he had. Some of these offices he had more than once, and you'll see it in the table that I put up. He was a selectman many times. I'm not sure how many times he was a constable. He was a raider. A raider is a different name, a raider. What the hell is a raider? It's the guy that decides how much taxes you pay. What are your assets worth? So when we start to levy taxes, we'll know whether we levy a lot on you or a little bit on you, okay? And that's what raiders, that was an office of the old town meeting. He also signed the oath of fidelity in the early days. He was a deputy. I don't know, a deputy to what, but sometimes a deputy to the town, the state, general court, and other things. He was a mill owner. We know that he was a juryman. He was a petitioner regarding the Taunton Bridge. Sometimes the town meeting would say, now we're going to get a committee together, and we want you to go and say, we're not paying for that bridge over the Taunton River up there. We don't use it very much, and those other people should pay for it. There's a lot of people said, let's not pay for this, and let's not pay for it. Remember, we're old Yankees. We don't pay for them. We shouldn't pay for them. Next slide, please. I don't think you can read that. I can read it. I'll put my glasses on. But I'll just quickly give you an idea of what it says. On the left-hand column, the page number in the town meeting records where you'll find a reference to Jonathan. And the year, month, and day is the town meeting record for which this text is, from which this text is extracted. And the first assignment he had on page 2 of the town meeting records, the second page, you have a Delano mentioned. He was a constable. Constable was the policeman. He's the guy who went out, kept order, collected taxes, did stuff like that. The second one, I actually quoted what it said. Jonathan Delano.
John Smith.
And somebody else assigned a raider. He was chosen a raider. That's the guy who's going to decide how many taxes you pay.
Today, is that an assessor?
You might think of it as an assessor, but they also had assessors. So I'm not too sure. I think in the Richard may know better than I do on this. The raider might have been an earlier term. So they used the word assessor later in these records. He was never called an assessor. Later on, Jabez or one of the other guys were called raider, or were called assessors. So I'm not sure.
I want to make the point that this was not a land tax. This was not your real estate taxes. This was your town tax, as in your poll tax, your
Right.
personal property tax.
Right.
Okay, because
And
we didn't have any land taxes until
later on, and
1764,
very late in the stuff, I have a slide that shows the relative value of horses, cows, sheep, swine, goats, etc., for purposes of taxing. So that you had you know, a pair of oxen and 3 horses and 15 pigs and so on. They'd figure out what your personal property was worth before they decide how much to tax you. To make a long story short, I did it in the summary, showed you that Jonathan was many different things. He was obviously a very capable person. And one of the conclusions I come to from seeing all these mentions of different Delanos having different responsibilities in the old town of Dartmouth, documented in the town meeting records, is that there had to be some pretty good genes in that family. You ought to be very proud of the roles that your family played in running the town of Old Dartmouth, because these are significant roles. Not every role is significant, but a lot of the roles are. And a lot of the roles were kind of common roles. I think surveyors of highways didn't necessarily mean a guy deciding where the layout was. Quite often they were a guy trimming the trees along the highway and doing stuff like that. But there was lots of significant roles we'll have the next name mentioned was Jonathan Jr. Well, obviously, I don't know the genealogy. I don't know which Jonathan this was. The record was he was doing something as an adult in 1700, and it's the only record we have, and he was a constable. Next slide. And this, you can see this a little better because I made it a little bigger. It's March, the meeting on March 28, 1700. I know there was a Jonathan Jr. Lieutenant Jonathan was probably the old Mr. Delano, but I don't know if there were other Jonathan Juniors later or not. So I'll leave that to the genealogist to take care of. Next slide. I want to move along because there are a lot of names. A lot of different Delanos were involved. Chavez was in there quite a few times. He was a petty juryman, just plain old juryman. I don't know the difference. Town clerk. He was another petitioner regarding the Taunton Bridge. He was a surveyor, and he was a moderator of the town meeting at times. And I think Sally told us he was also involved with the proprietors, if I'm not mistaken. These are the records. Again, these are a little more legible. It's kind of interesting to take a look at the language here. In 1712, this is very common language. At said meeting, said is very often used to refer back to something. At said meeting, Mr. Samuel Hunt, Captain Seth Pope, Captain Thomas David, Lieutenant Jonathan Delano, and Jabez Delano were chosen agents to petition the General Court at Boston for the town's excuse from being at any charge toward repairing the Taunton Bridge. So, you get that, right? You probably see some relatives among these other people. Samuel Hunt, Seth Pope, Captain Thomas Tabor, so forth. All common names in the town meeting records. There's a moderator at this date, surveyor of highways, etc. Next slide, please. Now, Lieutenant Jonathan, I think I know the answer that this is the original Jonathan, the owner of the forefather of it all in this area. And this is the record that refers to him as lieutenant. And he was one of the ones that was the agent on the town bridge. They want to put a little weight in that petition to the state government. So, they sent their best people. Next slide, please. We got it. Nathaniel Jr. Another junior Nathaniel was a very busy man in the town meeting records, and you'll see it later. But Nathaniel Jr., whichever person he was a constable and a surveyor, and he was a surveyor of highways along with other people. But you can see why, when they're talking about the village, they're talking about the whole, what we saw on the map, what today we would call New Bedford, Fairhaven, and Acushnet. That was Acushnet Village when they were doing highways back in before 1787. And all these guys were out there probably with a rake and a hoe and pitchfork or something, clearing up the road so that people could pass through it without getting killed by the branches hanging over. Next slide, please. Nathaniel, one of the busy guys, one of the men who had a lot of different responsibilities. All of these, committee man, and I put in parentheses, committee man is kind of generic. I looked at what he was doing on that committee. He was a financial auditor in our modern terms on that committee. He was also a financial investigator on another committee. And you'll see that he was trying to keep the town treasurers responsible for the town's money. And I think we got the actual language here. He was a petty juryman, this time to the Supreme Court, representative to the town, the general court, moderator, representative of the general court. He did layouts of the town. This is actual layouts, I think. Grand juryman for Superior Court, committee man, surveyor of highways for Cushnet Village. Again, the big place, not the little village at the head of Westport, at the head of the Cushnet River. This is a very interesting one. Fishing, I just call it a lawman. That's not the language in the town.
We call him the shellfish warden now.
Well, you might call him shellfish warden, but you'll see it had more to do with more than shellfish.
Right.
And I'll read you the actual record. It's quite an interesting record. Kind of part of showing you how life was different then. And here's a lawman. This is some of the details of one of these records. And I'm going to read this to you because I think I'll be quick, but it shows you what kind of responsibility they gave to Nathaniel Delano. It was voted that Captain Samuel Cornell, Beriah Gordon, and Nathaniel Delano, or any two of them, to be a committee, to be under oath, to examine, to determine where the town's money has been disposed of, and how it has been disposed of, and to whom, and for what that has been raised by rate or other ways to defray town charges, ever since the beginning of the year 1718. They did this in 1727. And to call the several town treasurers to account that have been in the time since with our present town treasurer. So all the past treasurers and the present one, you can go to your committee with a responsibility, go and talk to them, and let's get this thing straightened out. Where the hell's the money? And call any person, whatever, that may have any of the money which is of right belongs to the town, and have no money in anyone's hands that belongs to the town, except it be due them from the town, except in hand of our present treasurer. And when and so often as any person that hath any of the money which belongeth to the town, and neglecteth or refuseth to make up accounts when required by the said committee, is empowered to sue for said money and recover it for the use of the town, to see that all those to whom the town is or hath been indebted to ever since the beginning of the year 1718 as aforesaid, are paid their just dues, and out of the said money and receipts are passed where needful, that the town may not be forced to pay the same over again, and that the said committee give in what they have done. In other words, report what you've done, or can do in the particulars above mentioned by a report to the next annual meeting in March. That's a lot of responsibility. If you don't think so, think about it. It's a lot of responsibility. Next slide, please. Now here are a few of the other things that Nathaniel did. And this one I'll take a quick. This is more on that same issue. It took him a while to get this all straightened out. But this is giving us more right to sue and making up, if people refuse to make up accounts. Okay, and then they'll say, hey, the poor guy, he did a lot of work, give him 52 shillings for his services done in straightening that out. I have no idea how much 52 shillings is worth, but it's a lot more than 52 cents, I'm sure. And I think that's probably a generous thing. And these are other roles that he played. He's getting 10 more shillings here, going up to Boston to represent So you can see Nathaniel, now, I don't know what the genealogy says about Nathaniel, but it sounds to me like Nathaniel's a pretty heavyweight dude in this town of Dartmouth. Okay, so there's more of his doings and his responsibility. I won't read them, but you can see all this on the website. This is all available. If you want to read it in the original transcribed handwriting, we don't have it in the original town clerk's handwriting. We have it in the 1888 scribe's handwriting. You can see it that way too on a website. Now Jethro, another name from Scotland Neck, and I suspect one of the sons of Jonathan the forefather. Is that correct, Ms. Cushing?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure, okay.
No, I'd have to
There are
look.
more than one
I'd have to
Jethro.
look it up.
Yeah, okay, okay, but anyway, these are records from 1742 through 1760. And he was an agent in defense of the town in a lawsuit. He was assessor, he was a committee man, he was a collector in a lawsuit, the same lawsuit. He was an agent for the town against a proposal by Acushnet Village, again, New Bedford, Fairhaven, and Acushnet Village. They wanted to secede from Old Dartmouth. It's too far to walk to the town hall. In those days, the town hall was what you know of today is the foot of Slocum Road on Hathaway Road. That's where the town hall was. You had to walk from Sconneck Neck over there to go to town meeting. Not a good deal. Why don't we move, why don't we get out, why don't we split these towns now? And they tried to do it, it didn't pass. As they say in the town meeting record, it passed in the negative.
Yeah.
That's how they recorded it. Okay, more of Jethro's records. Again, I'm not going to read them. Some of them are very interesting, but I don't really want to take the time. But this suit here, to act, do something in order to stop an execution that is liable to be brought against the town by James Howland, John Tripp, and Jethro Delano, the former assessors. There's a very involved thing here where something happened that the town was getting sued, the assessors were involved, and there was going to be a collection, and they wanted to make sure the money went to the town and not to the people or something. You can read it. I don't want to try to decipher it here. It'll take too long. Next slide, please. Just more of same. This is still Jethro. This is where the suit was going to be taking place. He had a power of attorney to collect the money, and so forth and so on. Next slide, please. More Jethro. Jethro was a pretty busy guy, along with Nathaniel and the forefather, Jonathan. Okay, next slide. Captain Jethro, I don't know who Captain Jethro was. He had one record. He worked on the highway in 1754. The record, he worked along with some of these other people in the Acushnet Village. They had surveyors of highways for each quote village, because there were a lot of roads in these different villages, even in those days. There's a lot of work to do to keep things clear and passable. And you'll notice other names that are names from that side of Old Dartmouth. Jenny was from that side. West Island, of course. Morton, Cannon, minor place at name. Allen, all over the place. Lewis, Fairhaven, and New Bedford, Maine. Likewise, same names here. Next slide. Nathan was also recorded from 1760 to 1780. He was a surveyor of highways, a committee man during the Revolutionary War period, before he became an assessor. He was a surveyor of highways first, and again he was a surveyor of highways, and along with a lot of other local people in the Acushnet Village sections. By the way, Spooner, my father, grandmother was Euphemia Spooner. He always pronounced it Spooner, not Spooner. and that's kind of an old name. I'm descended from Euphemia, and Euphemia's father was Barnabas, and before him was Barnabas, before him was Barnabas, and Jonathan, and Hope, and all the way back to John Spooner and William Spooner. We're all connected. One of these days there'll be a wedding, we'll all be related. Abisha, another very busy guy, 1764 to 1776, the records, surveyor of highways for the village, constable, committee man. And this is during when there was a committee of correspondence and safety. This is during the Revolutionary War. Next slide, we'll see the detail. Down in here is a slide. This is May 21st, 1776. Gamaliel Church, Seth Pope, Abraham Sherman, Abisha Delano, Griffin Bonney, Benjamin Aiken, Fortunatus Sherman, Philip Sherman. Sherman's one of those names like Delano, you can spell it a lot of different ways. James Soule, spelled many ways. Nathaniel Richmond, sometimes Richmond. Philip Tabor, Brown L., William Wood. Committee of Correspondence and Safety, misspelled. Next slide, please. Calvin, we're getting near the end of the table. Calvin, 1780, a selectman. Selectman is a significant role when there are only a few selectmen running the whole town the size of Dartmouth. And this is a year when they voted to have 7 selectmen. Here's a Kirby, Russell, Spooner, Davis, Kempton, Hathaway, and Delano. Okay? Kirby's probably from Westport.
Yeah.
And you notice one of the habits was, one thing I didn't mention, but when they assigned town offices, there was usually somebody from each one of those 3 villages. The Peleg was there several entries, over 1764 to 1776, always in the same job, surveyor of highways. Again, lots of people there out there. You can see them smoothing out the road or doing whatever they did. Later on, my great-grandfather lived in the Cushnet, old North Fairhaven, and he worked on the roads, and he got paid $1 a day for him and a horse to work on the roads. That was a going rate. The surveyors of highways got paid in my great-grandfather's age, but maybe not earlier, I'm not sure. They may have paid their taxes that way. Next slide, please. Richard was the last guy in the records named Delano, and he was the surveyor of highways, and the last one is the actual record. And he was along with Michael Spooner, Philip Spooner, a lot of Spooners. Somerton House existed for a long time. We have a picture of it on our website. Obed Hathaway, Jenny was one of those names that, here's a name I don't see much, Demons. I don't know if it's misspelled the other name or what. That's how it's spelled in the records. And here's Richard Delano. Aiken spelled a few different ways. Hathaway, Dunnigan. Tallman is a lot of common Tallmans. Next slide, we're going to go to something different now. We're almost there. Hang on. Dinner time. Life was different then. I really want to take some time with these 3 or 4 slides. Excuse me. The town have ordered that the Indians shall have liberty, they are free, to hunt, provided that they do kill 3 wolves or 3 bears, or pay 10 shillings yearly to each village. And again, they're talking to the villages we've been referring to. The Indians that belong to Cushnet, are to pay 10 shillings to John Spooner. The Indians belonging to Pontiganset are to pay 10 shillings to Return Bedcock. He ran the mill at Smith Mills. And the Indians of Coxet are to pay 10 shillings to James Sisson, James spelled J-E-A-M-E-S. The aforesaid money is to be received for the town's use and delivered to the town at their demand. Now, I told you how the scribe would put in this is what she I'm transcribing what she transcribed. These are the original spellings. Do, kill, do. Do, kill. Village, village. Tree, tree. Wolves, bears, teen for 10, money without an E. Another way to spell 10. In the same record, they spell 10 two different ways. Received without an I. And my comment, wolves and bears, things really were different then. Not too many wolves and bears around now. Doesn't sound like too good a deal for the Indians.
Well, keep in mind, all the town of Fairhaven was bought for hardly anything. A few coins and some cloth and a pot.
That's a fact, that's a fact. And the Indians didn't even know they were really giving it up. They just were lending it for use. I wanted to go back, I wanted to finish that. Let's face it,
Oh, me too.
do you think it's possible to kill 3 bears or 3 wolves in a year? I don't imagine there were that many wolves and bears around, even then. If you didn't kill 3 and bring their heads in, you had to pay 10 shillings. 10 shillings, that's about a third of what we gave somebody for going to Boston later on, right? So where are the Indians going to come up with 10 shillings? Next slide. Shortly after that ordinance was passed, in 1685, they revised it. They changed the rules. So whereas it doth appear that Indian Robin, living at Saconnet, did kill a wolf sometime this last year within the township of Dartmouth. In other words, he was over there at Little Compton, but he came over and killed the wolf in Dartmouth. But he shall have 6 shillings paid him out of the town's rate by the constable at some convenient time after the making of this year's rate. After they collected the taxes, give that Indian 6 shillings. And that any Indian or Indians that shall kill any wolves or bears hereafter within this township, and bring the heads of said wolf or bear to the constable, shall have 6 shillings paid unto him or them for each wolf or bear so killed. Also ordered that the English shall have 10 shillings for the killing of a wolf or bear within this township, to be paid out of the town rate by the constable. Now, I ask you, do you think we were prejudiced in those days? The Indians got 6, Englishmen got 10 for the same thing. I'm kind of wondering, since this is a bounty, I'm wondering if the Indians ever got smart enough, or the English was smart enough, to make a deal with the Indians. Say, hey, I'll give you 7 shillings.
And we wonder why we had King Philip IV.
Yeah. Interesting stuff, huh? Okay. Another thing, life was different then. This is a little note in the town meeting record of 1686. And it's basically, if you look at it and evaluate what it is, it's an asset valuation guidance to rate somebody's personal assets. Personal assets in those days mostly accounted for land, real estate, that was real assets. Personal assets were movable assets, like the animals that you owned, the swine, the pigs, the oxen, maybe some furniture and stuff like that. And so most of it was on hoof of one kind or another. And the language, I got used to this because I've been reading these town meeting records for a while. Tule means secondly. It means secondly. They had, when they put out the warrant, they had 1 lee, 2 lee, 3 lee, 4 lee. It's just a shorthand in the town meeting records. So the second item in the warrant, or in the resolution by the town meeting, it is ordered that horse kind of 2 years old and upwards, horses older than 2 years, shall be valued at 50 shillings apiece. Oxen at 7 pounds a yoke, that's 2. Steers of 4 years old and upwards to be counted oxen. So a 4-year-old steer is worth an ox. And steers and heifers, 2 years old and 3 years old, will be counted as cows, and cows do value of 40 shillings. So if you pay some attention, you can make up a little table and say what everything is worth. And continuing, and a yearling, both meat and horse kind. Whether it's something you're gonna raise for beef, or if you're gonna, if it's a young horse, so if it's a young cow or a young horse, to be valued at 20 shillings apiece, and sheep and goats of a year and upwards at 5 shillings apiece, and swine or pigs of a year old and upwards at 8 shillings apiece. So that's a table of values for assessing your assets. Next slide, please. And all the misspellings, you're familiar with the misspellings. That's not a surprise, I'm sure of that. Now, another way things were different. You could pay your taxes, you were taxed, and fees were charged in different ways. This was what I call an early tax abatement and tax transfer program. At a town meeting, et cetera, it's spelled meeting, M-E-T-I-N-G. It is also ordered at said meeting that every householder, being a planter, I imagine everybody had a garden, right, shall kill 12 blackbirds between the first day of January and the middle of May yearly, on pain of forfeiting 3 halfpence for every bird they shall neglect of killing. Well, it's a roundabout way of saying, if you don't kill 12, you're going to pay for not killing. Okay? Of said number, forfeitures to be added to each defective person's town rate. In other words, your taxes go up if you don't kill those blackbirds. So you better pay attention at town meeting. To be paid to the town stock further, it is ordered that for every blackbird that shall be killed within a town within the time limited over the number of 12. So you kill more than 12, each party shall be paid 1 penny out of the town stock, or be abated out of their rate in the next hour. So you can abate your taxes if you're killing up blackbirds.
Who's watching? Who's watching?
You're gonna turn them in, baby. You can't, you're not, no cheating. You don't think those Yankees are gonna pay for something you didn't kill. And you can't, no sparrows are allowed, blackbirds only, right? But if you kill a big one, if you kill a crow, it's worth 3. It's worth 3 blackbirds. 1 crow's worth 3 blackbirds. It's also ordered that Joseph Tripp, Matthew Wing, Nathan Howland, John Russell, and Isaac Spooner be the persons to take account of what birds are killed in the town and give an account yearly to the selectmen, so that the penalty may be laid on those that are such as are negligent, and money may be raised to pay to them that kill more than their number. It is also ordered that there shall be a logbook bought for the town's use and to be paid for out of the town rate above said. Now, what do you think of that? Now, if we ever find that book, we would really think we'd get paid there. Those of us who are historians. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my work with you.